Okay, so good evening, everyone. I am not Maria Pascuzzi. I'm Beth Johnson, and Maria has another commitment tonight, so asked me to host. And so we're up to our very last evening of the Bible and Ecology with Paul Schutz. And so without further ado, welcome to everyone. And Paul, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Beth. Thank you all for being here over the last 5 weeks as we've had our sessions. And here, as Beth said, we come to our final session, looking to the very end of the scriptures and bringing in a whole bunch of different things. We have a sort of a smattering, a tasting sampler platter or something like that of all kinds of texts to bring us together in the New Testament frame of mind on this question of the Bible and ecology. So that's what we'll be doing. As a reminder, there'll be a couple times for questions. If you have a question along the way, you're always welcome to ask it or chat it in using Zoom's chat function. And then I'll open it up for questions at a couple of and comments at a couple of points as we go along tonight. So first thing is that I've lied to you. We're not going to start with the New Testament. I'm going to take us back to the Hebrew Bible for just a moment to kind of set things up tonight. And the text that I want to begin with as we start to look in this final session is the beginning of the Exodus narrative, the end of chapter 2 of Exodus into the first part of chapter 3. This is a text that has been really on my mind and heart for a long time, and I've published an essay on this specific text and trying to apply it ecologically. And the reason why I want to use it to set up our discussion of the New Testament is kind of for two reasons. One is I think this is a wonderful text, and it gives us all of the sort of categories and ideas with respect to just who is this God that we've been talking about over the last 5 weeks that seems to care so much for creation, this creator God. I think this text has something really interesting and important to say about that. And second, I think that this text is super important because the God that is presented here, this is the definitive sort of moment in God's self-revelation to the people of Israel, to the Israelites, before the beginning of the Exodus and their liberation from slavery in Egypt. This story is definitive in that way because it gives us a really crucial insight into who this God is and what this God desires for God's people, and I think more broadly for the world. And it never hurts to remind ourselves as Christians, in light of the legacy of anti-Semitism and the treatment of our Jewish brothers and sisters throughout history, that this is the exact same God that Jesus proclaimed, that Jesus prayed to, that Jesus knew, that Jesus learned about in his childhood as a young Jewish person. And so often that gets sort of swept under the rug or just outright missed in the interest of talking about how Jesus is different. And of course, in schools, I cannot count the number of times that I hear from students when I teach introductory courses that students have gone to Catholic school, come in and say, well, you've got the angry, God of the Old Testament and the loving God of the New Testament. And I always say, no, this is one consistent story. And that God that you're calling the angry God of the Old Testament, that's the same God that Jesus himself is proclaiming in his life, in his ministry, in his person. So I don't want us to lose that connection. And so to talk about the New Testament and ecology in the way that we're going to do it, I think it helps us for just a minute to kind of take a look at the character of this God, who this God is and what this God desires and those kinds of things. Because it's going to be very similar to what Jesus himself kind of proclaims and then how the New Testament witness gets us into that. So the first thing that I want to name, which is something that many scholars have commented on, is that this is not a God who is removed from the suffering of the world, from the suffering of God's people. God hears and remembers. The God of the Hebrew Bible always has to be reminded of the covenant. God remembers, recalls, brings it back to mind, the covenant, and looks upon them, and maybe not a great translation here in the NRSV took notice of them. Other translations use the verb, it's closer to the Hebrew, God knew. God sort of intimately knew, maybe felt, experienced with the Israelites their groaning in slavery. God intimately knew their suffering in the same way that, the word knew gets used for Adam knew his wife Eve to signal intimacy. The same kind of thing is going on here with the intimacy of God's knowledge of Israel's suffering. So that's the setup. That's the sort of bookend for this story. The introduction is the Israelites are suffering. God is aware. God feels, knows, hears their suffering, and decides out of God's commitment to them that God's going to do something about this. This narrative of liberation begins. And so that brings us to the burning bush, to the story of Moses walking along. He sees a bush that is on fire, but is not consumed. And he approaches that bush and hears a voice speaking to him that says, remove the sandals from your feet. This is holy ground. And then God, consistent with what we just saw, the Lord, as God is called here, says, I have observed, note that, again, observed, witnessed the misery of my people in Egypt, and they have cried out, and God says to Moses, I'm going to send you to Pharaoh, and you've got to tell them to let my people go, right? The classic spiritual gets at this. And then in the midst of this moment, God's voice crying out, Moses says to God, in a sort of classic prophetic protest, the prophets always protest their call at first, says, well, if I come to the people of Israel and I say to them that the God of your ancestors has sent me to you, which is what God has told Moses to say, and they say, well, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Well, a little cultural historical context, we know that in ancient myth traditions and ancient stories, the god of the gods, right, of different ancient cultures always have names. Zeus, Hera, in Greece, we've got, Ishtar and all these other figures from different civilizations. So Moses lives in Egypt, right? Think of Isis and the other, gods of Egypt. Moses lives in a context where gods have names. So he makes a reasonable request here. If they're going to say that, what name should I give them? Who has sent me to you? And God responds in Hebrew, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, I am who I am, is how this gets translated. And then later, Ehyeh, tell them that I am has sent me to you. And that is the one, this is my title, etc., etc. But the other name that God gives, it's crucial here, is the name YHWH, is how it's written in English. It is not pronounceable in Hebrew as it's given. It's what shows up every time this word Lord is in small caps. We're seeing that. The fancy scholarly name is the unpronounceable tetragrammaton, which sounds like a monster from Godzilla movie or something like that, the unpronounceable tetragrammaton. But that Greek means it has 4 letters that cannot be spoken. And those letters in Hebrew are a series of breathy consonants that sound something like that, like breath. If you could hear what I just did, I don't know if it comes across on Zoom, but sounds like the sound of wind or breath passing by. There are no vowels. Now, we often hear this name as Yahweh. That's the name whenever people speak it that gets used. When it's written in Hebrew, those letters, those vowels that make it pronounceable are not present there. And so historically, as people have interpreted the giving of this name, people have said, well, this I am who I am, this Ehyeh asher ehyeh, that means that God is associated with being itself, with this sort of radically transcendent, essence, the essay, the sort of very core of what it means to exist or to be. My critique of that reading is that very quickly leads us in both an anthropocentric and patriarchal direction, because there are all sorts of associations with being and rationality and masculinity, and it also, being, humans understood as the pinnacle, the high point of being, creates another one of these dualisms that sets us over the earth in this relationship of power. And I think this interpretation of the name of God as being about being about being, kind of leads us down that road. It also really emphasizes kind of highfalutin philosophical concepts instead of the actual context of this story, which is the story in which God is grieved to God's own heart by the suffering of God's people and decides to go down and do something about it, to set them free, to bring them to the fullness of life in this new land. I don't think we can separate the name that God gives from that context. And so often philosophers, Thomas Aquinas maybe foremost among them, have done that in the history of our Christian tradition. What I would emphasize is this: what if instead of associating this ambiguous Hebrew phrase with being, I am who I am, we listened to the sound of what Moses might have heard coming out of that burning bush, that bush that is on fire but not being consumed? Because when you pronounce the name as best you can without vowels, it again sounds like wind, breath, which we've seen over these 5 weeks in the biblical witness is that breath of life, the ruach of God. God gives God's own name as breath, as the source of life, the power of life that all creatures share. And you can think about that. God is not being itself, but God is life itself. And there's a really important qualitative dimension, in thinking about that distinction between existence and living fully, that I think has really, really, really powerful consequences for how we think about creation. You might think back to week 1 when I mentioned I read a passage from a book by Nicholas Lash, and that passage ended with the phrase, life is God given, right? Life is God given. Life is ruach given. Life is given, that kind of thing. So that's my alternative kind of reading of this passage, trying to sort of open it up to new lines of interpretation by really thinking about that name in a new way. And I would say this: if that's the case, then all of creation, couldn't we say that all of creation, amid its degradation and its crying out, its own suffering, is experiencing the deprivation of God's own breath, the breath of life within it? That breath is being diminished, choked off, and harmed in so many ways by our actions. And here I would just quote Pope Francis in Laudato Si and say, we have no such right. We have no such right to sever the breath of life from our creaturely brothers and sisters, because that breath of life, the Hebrew Bible tells us, is in all creatures, and God is itself that breath of life. God is that breath of life itself. So you might imagine, if God hears the cry of the poor in this way, right? The cry of Israel crying out, groaning in slavery, then wouldn't God, as the breath of life in all creation, also hear the cry of creation in this way? Think of the degradation of the land, the depletion of nutrients, the loss of topsoil, erosion, right? Deforestation, the loss of habitats for all of the wonderful animals on our planet, biodiversity loss, water polluted, filled with plastic, the thing that we've named the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, which is a rotating mass of trash in the Pacific Ocean. I don't know what's great about that other than its size, right? The horrible Pacific Garbage Patch. The food that is wasted, as we've said, 30 to 40% of food wasted every year in the United States while people starve around the world. Well, wouldn't this God that hears the cry of the Israelites hear the cry of the earth and the poor in that way too? I think the answer is obviously and pretty unequivocally yes, if we're taking the witness of Scripture seriously. And I just add to that this way of thinking about God's presence in creation, this connection with the name that God gives, offers a great resource for teaching and preaching and fostering actual care for creation. Because what if we centered our imagination on this God? What if we thought of God in this way, imagined God in this way? Not the, old man overlord in the sky, but the very breath of life that is among us and with us and breathing itself through all of creation now and existing far beyond anything that we can imagine at the same time. Right? It's what we call God's transcendence and God's immanence, being right there and being beyond what we can imagine at the same time. And I'd say, to anybody that might say, okay, you're kind of stretching the bounds of interpretation here. I would just add one last detail, which is that in the story of the burning bush, the bush is not consumed by God's presence. Unlike us, humans who have historically destroyed and twisted and wreaked havoc on creation in order to make ourselves known, to make our ends known, to accomplish our goals, God accomplishes this miraculous self-revelation to Moses in the terms of this story by making a bush appear to be on fire, but not actually burning it up. God respects the integrity of the bush. God respects the integrity of creation, even as God makes God's self known. God doesn't need to destroy creation in order to advance God's aims, the quest to liberate Israel. God does it by working in harmony with creation. And I think there's a beautiful lesson in there for us too, as we think about these relationships between the Bible and ecology. So I wanted to kind of begin with this story because it sets up the ministry and the witness of Jesus. And one of the most important ways that we, or important places we could look for that connection is here in Luke 4, when Jesus, reads the scroll on the Sabbath. And look at how Jesus characterizes his own ministry as being anointed with the Spirit of the Lord to bring good news to the poor. Now, in these days, we're talking about the poor, not only as human poor, but also as the poor of creation itself, understood as poor, impoverished by our actions. God has come, Jesus has come, he says, to release captives, to give sight back to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, and so forth. This is exactly in parallel with the God who reveals God's self to Moses in the burning bush in Exodus 2. Can't overlook that connection. The God who liberates, the God who frees, the God who brings people, restores people to the fullness of life. And I think by using that kind of middle category of the poor, we can expand that to our attention to be able to see creation and as part of that mission of God to the world and ministering in that way. So that's just kind of a couple of foundations that I wanted to start us with for moving into this conversation. And I thought it would be good just to pause here for a second. And I'd love to hear from, one or two or three people maybe on this question, like, what if we saw our God and God's relationship to the world in the way that I've just described it? We understood the ministry of Jesus as this liberation, setting free to the fullness of life, not only for us as humans, but also for creation as a whole. If we heard that preached or taught, and practiced in pastoral care and things like this, what do you think might be different about the way that Catholics, Christians around the world are living their faith? It's kind of a broad question, but I'd love to hear, how does kind of changing this image of God change everything else or influence everything else? Yeah, Elizabeth, please.
I'm wondering about the whole conversion to being vegetarian. I'm always curious about how students are taking this on as a new sense about, yes, this is what we need to move into. It's a reverence for life that we have not had before. And somehow it brings us to a new place around food.
Yeah, I think it does, centering the idea that all creatures are beloved of God, have the right to live and have the right to flourish, raises the question in a really powerful way about what we choose to eat and whether we choose and on what scale we choose to eat meat, to eat animal products, all these kinds of things. And we know, just to throw out a statistic here as we're thinking ecologically, we know that cutting one's meat consumption by even a third can reduce an individual carbon footprint by up to 40%, depending on how much a person is eating. So imagine that if you eat meat 3 meals a day, every day of the week, and you choose to eat meat simply 2 days, or 2 times a day, that's cutting by 1/3. The impact on the person's carbon imprint is very significant. And so we have sort of statistical data, because what if everyone did that? The whole of the United States, let's say, did that. Well, it's going to funnel up into the whole supply demand chain and that whole system, because people aren't going to be desiring meat anymore. And so the meat industry is going to shrink, which means that all of the carbon and methane and everything else, the water use that goes into raising animals for human consumption, especially within the industrial farming paradigm that we've talked a little bit about before, all of that is going to shrink to the Earth's benefit. So then the ethical question becomes, what should we be doing once we know that? And once we believe in a God whose breath is present in everything, and the breath that the animals breathe is the same breath of life, does that change our perspective on our diets? Should it change our perspective on our diets? And those are some of the ways I think that my students in particular are entering into that conversation, and this sort of revolution that's happening, small in some ways, big in others, around vegetarianism and veganism, I think is a wonderful, practical way of thinking about our practices, how we provide food, what we eat, and so on. Any other observations, questions, thoughts on what impact or influence or what this might change, centering our theological imagination on a God like this? Please go ahead, continue on.
I was thinking about all of the rainforests in the Amazon being cut down for making grassland for cattle. And this would totally revolutionize and help to have the rainforest be our lungs in a new way, that we have been destroying them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Beth Johnson was with us, one of the first people, not, among the first, to point out the sort of, interesting dynamic that we've talked about many times, that, trees don't need us, but we need trees in order to survive, right? Trees, the lungs, whenever we talk about, the Amazon is the lungs of the earth. What a beautiful image, right? We are choking off that breath of life that's being provided to us by those trees through the wonders of photosynthesis and all these processes. But deforestation is a very anthropocentric problem. We say we need those trees and we have the right to take them. But do we think about that sort of intangible function that they are providing clean, breathable air for every creature on Earth? They are mediating to us in this sort of particular ecological way the very breath of life that we understood, in this reading of the story, to be God's own presence. Trees as mediators of the divine breath. Think about that. I mean, that changes, as you said, Elizabeth, the whole context for thinking about these things. It's another beautiful illustration. Any other last thoughts? Otherwise, we'll move ahead. All right. Well, let's forge.
Can I say something?
Sorry,
I can't find my raise hand button.
No, that's fine. I saw it on the screen just as I was about to change. Go ahead, Sarah, please.
So I'm an introverted thinker, so let's see how this comes out. But just in reflecting on this, what keeps bubbling up for me, and maybe it's because I've spent all day at a Catholic high school advocating for the Farm Bill on behalf of Bread for the World. What's bubbling up for me is this whole climate crisis issue and how we're approaching it. Preached the science for years, and that didn't convince anybody. And now we're seeing all of these weather-related events that are starting to turn people's heads. And with these students, so many of them are very passionate about this because it's their future. And one of the things I kept saying today multiple times, not only because I had multiple classes, but because it took me a while to grasp it. And that is when we talk about the dear neighbor, and they have it plastered everywhere because this is a high school where Sisters of St. Joseph of Orange were. the dear neighbor, yes, are those on the margins, people and creation. And just trying to get them to think about creation as on the margins and caring for it in that way. And how we've lost our connection to food and farm and the earth because we don't prepare our own, or we don't farm, we don't we don't grow our own foods. And I said, well, what would happen if we didn't have farmers? You'd be out there in the morning, harvesting your breakfast, milking the cows, squeezing the oranges for the orange juice, it would be a lot more, work, but just trying to give them real life examples of how we've lost that connection. And what I would like to offer is for ways to restore that connection and restore, because this connection to creation is our connection to God. And it's such a lively living connection. And one last thing, my housemate's on this call, but so she knows that I trained as a soil advocate. And that is a thing with an organization called Kiss the Ground. And soil is alive. There are billions of microorganisms in the soil that lead to its health. And again, sharing that with them today, it's like when I think about the breath of life and the breath that's just flowing in the soil alone, it's mind blowing. And that we need to, the soil is on the margins as well. We need to help, conserve that too. So I don't know, just some random thoughts that are coming around with regards to climate change.
Yeah, no, those are wonderful thoughts and such good connections that bring the sort of concrete ecology, which is one of the things, my goals for today's session was to really center on some of those thoughts. So we're talking about soil, we talk about farming, we talk about water and food. That's also important, and I've heard this statistic a few times that in the past 100 years, the number of people who participated in some form of subsistence farming has dropped from, I think, 60 to 70% of the population to less than 2% of the population as supermarkets boomed, especially after World War II. So that the whole context of our relationship to food and land and all of these things has changed. And one of the things people point out is that the more distanced we are from the sourcing and production of the food we eat, the more indifferent or the more sort of passive we are able to be with respect to where that food came from, what the experience of the animals was like, what they lived through, how they died. We don't have to care about any of that anymore. And so the sort of the humane treatment of animals becomes an add-on rather than an intrinsic part of our care for creation. And I personally think that, in a context like the schools that you're working in or schools that any of us are associated with, there are many different ways to approach teaching the Christian tradition. And, in light of Laudato Si and, everything we've done in these few weeks, why not, try to center our education and our formation of young people on these ecologically informed readings of the scriptures? They're learning them anyway. They're going to learn about Genesis. They're going to learn about creation. So why not at least include that as a part of the picture? I think we can do that. And I always tell my students when they come back to me and say, well, is it really going to take a meteor? Is it going to take some sort of like terrible cataclysm to wake people up to this stuff? I don't have an easy answer to that question. I hope not. But I sometimes worry that that's the direction we're heading in, or people care for what they can see. They care about what they can see. So when the weather changes, they start to notice, these kinds of things. But I really think that the deepest level of change is always going to be the best level of change as well. We can change people at the level of how they see God and see the world and see God and the world and themselves in relationship to one another. That's where the rubber is really going to hit the road. And I hope that, classes like this and others that we do through Spirit Alive and programs can give us resources for talking about some of those relationships in new ways. So, Sarah, thank you. This is a wonderful bunch of reflections that we can kind of put together with what we're talking about. All right, I'm going to move us ahead. If anybody else has thoughts, save them or add them to the chat, and we will come back around in a few minutes to those. So I want to bring us now fully into the New Testament. We just made the transition there with Jesus. And I'm going to start with just a couple of basic preliminaries here that, in Matthew, when we go to the Gospel of Matthew now, we get this moment when Jesus is being questioned, what law is what's the greatest commandment? And Jesus says to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus concludes, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. That last line is really important because this phrase, the law and the prophets, in the Judaism of Jesus' time, refers to the whole of the Jewish tradition of which Jesus was part. So the law and the prophets, we're talking about everything. Jesus is saying everything depends on the extent to which a person loves God and loves neighbor. Understanding, of course, as we've already heard tonight, that those two things are united. Everything is fulfilled in love, right? But this might raise the question for us, well, what is love? In the eye, we talk about love a lot, and I think often it's sort of commodified and reduced to some sort of Hallmark, card kind of thing. But love in the understanding of the New Testament is much richer and more complex than that. And coming out, if we're going to connect Matthew and Luke, coming out of what Jesus says that connects him back to that tradition of liberation and fulfillment and all of those kinds of things, I think that even gets sort of like a stronger hold on our imagination when we look at passages like Matthew 25:31-46, which is the famous judgment scene, the Son of Man in glory, sitting on the throne and separating the sheep and the goats. You go over here, you go over here, sheep on the right, goats on the left, all these kinds of things. And then we get the famous question, right? The king will say to those at the right, you have inherited the kingdom of God, and why? Well, Jesus explains, or the king, the Son of Man explains, for I was hungry and you gave me food, thirsty and you gave me drink, a stranger and you welcomed me, naked and you clothed me, sick and you took care of me, in prison and you visited me. Now, these are all bodily practices of love. Caring for the embodied person, the embodied self here, the corporal works of mercy. We hear that terminology in our tradition. Jesus is giving the foundation for those here, but the key here is that is the essence of what it means in Jesus's own sort of imagination, as its story is being told here in Matthew 25, of what it means to follow Jesus and inherit the kingdom. It's not on the basis of prayer and piety and holiness and, performance and those kinds of things. It's on the basis of the extent to which we show embodied care to others. Now, if we're going to take this broader framing of creation that we've been talking about, creation as the new poor, as Sarah was just saying, and that the suffering of creation, the crying out of creation, becomes a basis for us reflecting on our own action, our own ethics, our own commitments to the whole world. Well, then, in what ways do we feed a hungry creation? Give creation what it needs to drink whenever it is thirsty, right? Do we welcome creation when it is strange to us? Do we go out to it? Do we seek it out? Do we clothe it when it's naked, care for it when it's sick, right? Creation can be inserted into this narrative as another way of expanding the boundaries of love as we understand it, and not losing that central focus on embodied practices of care as the essence of love. But now it's not just about caring for the poor humans among us, it's about caring for the whole of creation insofar as creation is suffering and struggling. So that's another resource that I think when we're thinking about this idea that love of God and love of neighbor are tied together in this, and I'll say more about this in a bit, that creation itself becomes the core of understanding what it means to, do the corporal works of mercy, to do this practice of embodied care, broadens the context for our understanding of that. And that's not the only place that we see that emphasis. This is the opening of the first letter of John. And I since the first time was back when I was writing my dissertation that, I encountered this research from Raymond Brown, the great scripture scholar on this stuff, really emphasizes that in this first line here, look at what the author emphasizes, what we have heard, what we have seen, what we have looked at and touched concerning the word of life. Now, of course, here the authors of this letter are referring back to those who knew Jesus in his embodied self, right? They heard his voice, they saw him with their eyes, they looked at him and touched him. And that's coming out, just a side note here, Brown says, of this concern that certain interpretations of the Gospel of John among early Christians were leading to a sort of disembodied, spiritualized understanding of Jesus. And the authors of this letter wanted to really remind the community that Jesus was encountered in the flesh as a true human person and was heard and seen and touched and all of those things. And that out of that, we get the proclamation of the word of life. And that word is declared so that the joy of all may be complete, right? But I say, what about another connection to creation as that which we have seen and looked at and touched that conveys to us the word of life as the instrument of God's, as the channel of God's own breath coming to us in the world? Just as Jesus is the word or the wisdom of God uttered on that breath of God, so too creation, as we saw last week, is the manifestation of that wisdom, the concrete coming into being of God's own presence among us and is breathing to us that same word of life. So I don't think that this is a limited instance, these connections that we're making about embodied care and touch and being truly, really present to what's going on around us. It's everywhere throughout the New Testament. The emphasis on spiritual salvation, so to speak, relative to the emphasis on bodily care for others, it's the bodily care for others wins the day if you look at the witness and the proclamation of Jesus nearly every time. And let's not forget the creation is another embodied presence among us. Our ecosystems, Sarah said, the soil is full, informed with millions upon millions of microorganisms, a system of life, the word of life right before our eyes. All right, the last point I'll make here as we go into this, keeping in mind, of course, that this tradition that has the name John also contains the line with which I started this course, John 10:10, right? I have come that they may have life and have it more abundantly, right? But that phrase follows Jesus saying, the thief, on the other hand, comes to kill and to steal and to destroy. But I have come, right, for the abundance of life. Now think about those verbs, kill and steal and destroy, with respect to the issues of deforestation and overconsumption and all of these things that we're talking about. So often we humans have been the killers, right? The stealers, the thieves, the destroyers, rather than those who, inspired by this witness of Jesus, have been instruments of the fullness of life. And I think there's a demand on us as individuals, as communities, to really sit with that if we're going to sort of hold up this name Christian as, follower of Jesus as part of our identity. All right. So that brings us, thinking with this, to this wonderful, fascinating passage in the middle of Romans chapter 8, which many scholars have commented on, that gives us this image of creation waiting with eager longing for the revelation of the children of God, right? And then that creation has been subjected to futility, right? And in that futility is groaning in labor pains, right, for fulfillment. Creation is groaning in labor pains for fulfillment in perfect union with God. And that is what Paul is writing here, right? Because then he continues, and not only the creation, but we ourselves are groaning as well. So Paul begins with creation and then turns to us as part of that creation. Just as creation was sort of, longing for the revealing of the children of God, so now creation is groaning for fulfillment. And I think that is such an important image for us when we're thinking about ecological distress. But keeping in mind that also, like we saw last week with that language of all things in the letter to the Colossians, that this isn't just about creation longing for that fullness of redemption, but that creation is promised that fullness of redemption as part of the the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus and the redemption that that brings to the world. And, you know, in the tradition of, say, liberation theology, one of the principles that comes through here would be to say, that's not just nice, like pie in the sky language that we're talking about. Whenever we're talking about the liberation and fulfillment of the poor, the liberation and fulfillment of women and creation, people of color, you know, LGBTQ people, those things that people are so passionate about, all of those commitments, all of those desires, those various forms of groaning and labor pains, desiring the fullness of redemption, they aren't just nice promises about some future far off. They put demands on us with respect to how we choose to live in the world in the here and now as followers of Jesus. This future fulfillment that we are groaning and longing for, we are responsible for living that future now, for building that future, cultivating that future now. And that should have an effect on the choices that we make, because this isn't just, as we've seen, about spiritual salvation and that kind of redemption. This is about the redemption of our very own bodies, embodied practices of care, especially for the poor. And that goes all the way back, right, to the revelation of God to Moses in that burning bush that is not consumed by the fire, and the breath of life that God reveals God's self to be for us. And so to me, all of this kind of holds together as a paradigm for thinking about what it means to be a Christian in a world threatened by ecological degradation. And there are all these different parts and pieces, but there is a deep moral and ethical demand that's put on us to live on behalf of this order of redemption, not to just look forward to it, but to work to make it so now, because our God in Christ and in the work of the Spirit has revealed to us the kind of world that we are supposed to inhabit. And recognizing that we don't inhabit that world calls us to account for living the way of living that we take up with respect to that vision of fulfillment. So I think that is a sort of broad look at some of what the New Testament gives us. I have a couple more thoughts, but I want to do a little interlude here on the way to our next text, which I think is going to bring everything together. We had trouble with this, so as long as can everybody see the two images on the screen reasonably well? All right. Good. We had trouble when I blew it up to full screen, so I'm going to leave it like this just to be safe. The Ignatian tradition, Ignatian spirituality, has this practice called composition of place. Anybody familiar with this already? What composition of place is? A little bit. Okay. So composition of place is a practice in Ignatian spirituality that often is intended to bring the stories of Jesus alive in a new way or in a fuller way. And the way that this gets practiced is that the person who is doing the spiritual exercises of Ignatius or engaged in spiritual reflection finds a way not just to read the story and ask sort of what sort of lesson is there here, but actually tries to place herself or themselves or himself within the story and to imagine what it would have been like to experience that story, being the person beside Jesus in the crowd, you know, when he's teaching or when he forgives the woman caught in adultery. How does that change the way that we experience the scriptures, to locate ourselves within the story and imagine ourselves in that world of the text? Like I suggested, maybe that we imagine ourselves standing beside Moses at the burning bush and hearing the name of God, not philosophizing about what the text says, but hearing what Moses heard. So for a moment, I want to invite us into a similar practice here with these two images. I'll give you all about a minute to just reflect on what you see here. And I invite you to put yourself into one of these pictures. You don't have to be a sentient object. You don't have to be a thinking or feeling thing. You can be whatever you want in the image. But just to put yourself into the image here and imagine for a moment what it would be like to be in that scene, experiencing it as it's sort of unfolding based on what you see in the pictures. So take a minute and reflect in that way. Then I'll ask for maybe two people to share what that experience was like. All right. So maybe one, or let's say two people willing to share kind of what you became in the image and what you experienced kind of being in this world of the photo. Yeah. Tootie, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I chose the sea scenery, and I became the coral. And how I experience it now, in just like in many places in the world, the coral is dying. And that really saddens me.
Mm. It's great. Yeah, and it contrasts so much with sort of the beauty of the coral as it is here. Imagine the positive version being sort of swept around in the waves. You have fish dancing in and out and, you know, nibbling on your arms or whatever it is, you know, but you're part of this wonderful system of life. And yet we know that, you know, things like coral bleaching and the death of coral reefs is happening around the world. So we experience that contrast. Yeah. Anybody else? Yeah, Pat, go ahead.
If you mean me.
Yes, is that wrong? Sorry, your name on the screen is iPhone Pat, so I'm not sure. I guess.
Okay.
Tell me your real name.
My real name is Patty.
Okay, Patty, there we go.
I'm looking at this picture again, also of the sea, and I'm just thinking, the only time I ever was near a coral reef and was actually looking at beautiful things like this, there were so many fish, little schools of fish that would come right up to your face and your body, and it was very embodied. And I, not being much of a diver at this point, I couldn't stay in the right position and do it well. So the reality and this picture clash a bit. Not really, but
yeah,
you're there and you think it's wonderful and you can't believe it's happening to you, and still it's not working well.
yeah. No, I resonate very strongly with that. Since I moved to California, Hawaii has become a favorite getaway. There's so much great snorkeling and reef snorkeling and things like that in Hawaii, and I really resonate with that experience of seeing. And I think maybe I mentioned this before a couple of weeks ago. I always think of this line from Darwin's On the Origin of Species: endless forms most beautiful, as just like what it's like to be there in the reef and to see all of the fish and all of the life around you. And also, Patty, I think what I hear and really resonate with is the first time that I tried to snorkel, it was like half hyperventilation and half, you know, success, or less, you know, less success. You know, because you really have to learn how to breathe slowly and attune yourself to your breath and be present in that way and just float right with the fish and be able to do it well. And there's something about that that sort of brings us to an awareness, I think, of how different we are from the rest of the species in that ecosystem. It really puts into perspective that, like, we're the outsider entering this ecosystem in a particular way, because the fish and the turtles and the coral and everybody else that's there, they're just going about their everyday business. And here, you know, big fleshy human, you know, creature comes along, and we're there as the observer out there looking in. But it does kind of cast this, like, it leads to this recognition of how different we are from that system. And I think that can be really humbling, and it can kind of put us in perspective, you know, give us a perspective on the way that we think about our ecological relationships as well. So I don't think it's just all about this, you know, there's that dissonance, but I think that dissonance is really meaningful too, with as a way of getting us to reflect a bit on who we are as a species among other species. One creature among all of these other creatures in this wonderful systems of life that we don't even understand and that we're not capable of relating to, you know, like a turtle or a fish can. So I think there's a lot of wonderful stuff there. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. So I'm going to take us now to a second image, and we're going to do the same thing. Take a little silent pause, reflect on these two images, become something within one of them, and then we'll hear from maybe two people again about the experience of being in the image. So here's the second set of images. Am I willing to share what you became and what you experienced, reflected upon, and looking at these images? Yeah, Elizabeth, please.
Way too much grief to hold it.
The picture of the boat and the people and their homes remind me that very wealthy people go to islands like this, and they are in walled communities with guards with machine guns to keep anybody else out. This is a vacation scenario.
Yeah.
And how incredibly unfair, wrong this is, that all of this garbage is here, and these people probably don't even have electricity for more than a few hours a day. It's very upsetting.
Yeah. Sarah, please.
I just wanted to say, when I looked at both of them, I was like choking, because the turtle is struggling to, looks like struggling to breathe, and the river is struggling to live and breathe. And we're talking about breath. And these are perfect examples of, like, I can't breathe.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's been another connection, of course, with, you know, racism and the Black Lives Matter movement, the slogan, "I can't breathe," you know, being a part of that as well. Whenever we think about this intersectionally, this breath of life has so much significance. But right here, as you said, Sarah, the turtle not being able to breathe, and, you know, the river not being able to breathe, probably the people too here not being able to breathe. You know, I use these images to juxtapose that cry of the earth and the cry of the poor together. And I think, Patty, as you said it, there's a way that this highlights, that these images highlight the injustice, the dual injustice, right? But parallel and intersecting injustices of ecological degradation and like the wealth gap in the world, or we could talk about racism, or we could talk about all kinds of other things, because they're all interrelated insofar as they're all part of this logic of domination and destruction that some interpretations, as we've seen, of Genesis 1 and 2 can easily, all too easily, I would say, support and have supported. So, you know, I bring this in as a way of kind of, and I think that, Elizabeth, your comment as well, just the grief, right, of this, it brings together this, what the theologian Edward Skilbeck talks about. It kind of evokes a negative experience of contrast, right? Thinking about the difference between these images and these images. And one of the things that I've reflected upon, you know, ecologically, when I've thought about the sort of putting these four images side by side, is that both of these things are in our world right now at the same time. Both of these things, both of these experiences or image, you know, sets of images are in our world right now at the same time. All four images were taken by National Geographic photographers, and they relay to us sort of two very different worlds, but they're the same world. And we're there, you know? And so I think about that image of creation groaning for fulfillment and us groaning for fulfillment. Imagine the grief, the groaning of this turtle, the groaning of these people who, as Patty said, may live on an island where wealthy tourists can come. You know, I even think back to the conversations we have on our campus here at Santa Clara about the way we're reaching out beyond the sort of like, you know, borders of our community, or, you know, the student activists at Fordham who would, when I was a graduate student there, who would talk about Fordham as a gated community in the midst of the Bronx, right? And, you know, that image has significance for how we think about ecological and economic justice in these relationships. Think about that image of groaning and crying out. Think of, you know, statistics like that, you know, through human action, deforestation and habitat destruction, we have increased extinction rates to somewhere between 100 and 1,000 times their natural rate. Systems around us are falling apart. And yet, in the midst of that, all of us here are, you know, here because we're committed to a tradition that is rooted in this idea of a God, the word, you know, made flesh, an incarnate God who has proclaimed to us this message of life and liberation and fullness. And that is kind of at the core, at the root of what we're thinking about. So again, the question comes up, what does that have to say for how we live? What does that have to say for how we teach, how we preach, the choices we make, the institutional approaches we have? There's so much here to consider, and I hope everyone can, you know, take that home and kind of ponder it as we continue to go forward from these sessions. Now, to bring this sort of part and transition us over to Q&A, I wanna look briefly at two last texts. And the first one is very familiar to us, of course. You can just look at the title, The Parable of the Good Samaritan, and you know what the story is going to be about. We all know this so well. Where I would focus our attention, though, here as we're thinking ecologically, is on that question that sort of sets the whole story into motion, right? The lawyer who's trying to justify himself, that asks Jesus this challenge, and who is my neighbor, right? Now, think back for a minute to those two images that we looked at, and the fact that those are both images of the world in which we live. These are our neighbors: the choking turtle, the impoverished family, the trash, you know, bank, the river, and the turtle and the coral and all of it. These are our neighbors, right? And so if we start to think, as we were talking about, Sarah said and others have said, you know, in what ways can we understand creation as rejected, poor, marginalized, or like the man in the story, left to die on the side of the road, right? Think of that trash pile on the coast and creation being left to die on the side of the road. There's, to my mind, an unfortunately sort of apt analogy here for our treatment of the natural world and the way that the priest and the Levite treat the man who has been, you know, robbed and beaten and left to die, right? We're so often indifference, which is really what this story is about, the indifference of the priest and the Levite, but also our human indifference toward those who are suffering around us. That's the core of Jesus's teaching here. And when we view that you know, indifference in an ecologically, you know, oriented way, we can easily see how sort of going through the motions and making easy choices in our day-to-day lives so easily just replicate, you know, the system that destroys creation, both human creation and other creation. We're all creation, right? So all of those things are together, and we may not want, I understand this, and I definitely am guilty in the sense of, you know, it's not easy, as I think Elizabeth said, grief, to be in the presence of suffering and death in that way. But it's out there around us. And this story reminds us as Christians that every day there are creatures who are being beaten and left for dead on the side of the road. And we have the opportunity through our choices to either be present to them, like the Samaritan himself, an outcast, you know, to them. And an analogy here is just that I'm always so taken and also a little bit saddened by the fact that here on our campus, for example, when social issues come up, it's typically, you know, the students of color, the queer students, those who have experienced hardship and harm themselves in one way, shape, or form because of who they are. They're the most compassionate people when the sort of moment comes for people to come together. And I think for people who occupy more privileged, you know, positions, it's so much harder sometimes to really acknowledge suffering and put ourselves there with the suffering, just like God feels, hears, knows the suffering of Israel, and then to respond to it. But I think that is really the essence of what it means to love our neighbor, to show mercy to all of creation, and to listen to Jesus when he says, now go and do likewise, right? A great reflection on this comes in a book by James Nash, a scholar who's written on this. He has a chapter where he says, love of nature is just love of neighbor with broader boundaries, right? Love of nature is just love of neighbor with broader boundaries, because we have limited the idea of neighbor so narrow, so narrowly to our human neighbors, but we've often forgotten that the rest of the world, everything in those images, everything we see when we walk out of our doors into the world is our neighbor too. And it too is groaning, it too is struggling. And that should have an effect on us if this God that we've been discussing, made incarnate in Jesus and in the presence of the Holy Spirit in all creation, has a claim on us as Christians. All right. So that Good Samaritan story, another way that we can kind of broaden the practical justice-oriented dimensions here. And I want to conclude with a quick look at the last 2 chapters of Revelation, because this is really where everything kind of comes together. It's the last book of the Bible. It is the vision of this eschatological future, this future fulfillment that we have been promised. And, we get the passing away of the new heaven and the new earth, which I think is a complicated image to deal with ecologically. We have to handle that with care. But what I would emphasize here, is that the new creation is a glorified creation. And in that glorified creation, we see the one seated on the throne saying, I am making all things new, right? I am making all things new. There is this newness of life, this restoration. And look, at the end of God's work in the world, we get this image of the water of life as that which flows out anew to creation and replenishes and restores the flourishing, the fullness of life for which creation was always intended, all the way back from Genesis 1. God gives water to the world from the spring of the water of life. No longer are we in the old garden where the fall, the first sin happens, but here we are in this new flourishing creation with the water of life flowing among us. Drink to all the thirsty. And I would point out that the one seated on the throne does not indicate a species here, does not say, which people get the water of life, but to the thirsty, right? And certainly we have thirsty, as we have seen, of every species here. To the thirsty I will give this water. All right. So that is the sort of foundation here. And then in chapter 22, the final chapter of the Bible, the final chapter of the book of Revelation, we get another image here now, the river of life, this water of life, the river of the water of life that flows through the New Jerusalem, bright as crystal from the throne of God, right? And what is beside that river but a flourishing tree with 12 kinds of fruit, a different kind of fruit each month, right? Kind of an interesting, neat tree. Think about that though. Abundance, fullness, variety, biodiversity, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. This tree has restorative properties. It brings about health and the full, again, life as essential here, as flourishing. And so this is heaven on earth and earth in heaven. It's not a heaven outside our world, but it is the lifting up and fulfilling of this world. And the core image here is flourishing. The core image here is all things coming to life again by partaking of this water that flows from God. And that, to me, at the end of our sort of 5-week whirlwind tour of the Bible and ecology, I think is such a powerful concluding image. It gives me a lot of hope personally, because I wonder again, I ask again, what would happen if we made, that image, that flourishing tree with the fruit, sort of the center of our ecological imagination, recognizing that water of life, the breath of life, these core images we've explored are really images of abundance and fullness, and that we are called out of and from those images in faith to foster that same abundance, which is rooted in love and justice as proclaimed by Jesus. And, creation asks of us, God asks of us no less than to live that kind of life on behalf of that kind of fulfillment, co-partners with God in ending suffering and providing for the needs of all, not just humans, but the tapanta, the all, the everything, right? Liberating all things to be fully alive in a relationship with God and thinking ecologically in a relationship with each other. And I think that when we read the Bible carefully in these ways, that's the vision that we're presented with. And there's so much promise and potential in thinking with these things, as far as we can kind of bring them into our hearts and into our institutions and our teachings and really let them orient our imagination of what it means to be Christians in a world threatened by ecological degradation, but in the midst of this promise of the fullness of life that the scriptures attest to. So I will end my comments there and say thank you for your attention and participation. And we've got time for a little bit of discussion. And so I open the floor for that now. Yeah, Tootie, please.
Sorry, I came in a little like 15 minutes late, and you guys were talking about the consumption of meat. And I think we as a nation, we need to also be cognizant the fact that businesses in the United States actually are spreading their business throughout the world, and what they taught the people over there are more meat, more consumerism. And for example, the worst river in the world happened to be in my homeland, which is Indonesia. And that is sad, but we cannot just judge the people in Indonesia, because we produce the textiles, and those textile production using all sorts of chemicals, and it's just dumped to the river, and that is brought for export in the United States. So we just need to be more cognizant and be more sensitive in the companies that we support.
Yeah.
Whether it's eating more hamburgers, for example, eating French fries that's cooked in palm oil. I mean, the entire island of Borneo is decimated for the timber, and then it's replaced with palm oil production. So there's a lot of things that we cannot say we can't do anything. But the little thing that we can do collectively, I believe, can make a difference.
Yes. No, that's so true. And you do such a good job in that comment, Tootie, of highlighting, again, the sort of intersectional, aspect that everything is linked together within the system. And what you're describing, scholars talk about, economic neocolonialism, which is kind of a fancy word for, thinking about the ways that the United States and other nations have reached out through outsourcing and production and things like that, sending labor off to countries where it can be done cheaper, which usually really means paying an inhumane wage to people. We're not actually talking about cheap labor. We're actually talking about abusive labor, in most cases.
Child labor too.
Yeah, and child labor, right? Sweatshops and all of these kinds of things. And then that, as you said, perpetuates the cycle of ecological degradation too, because one of the reasons that companies in the US and other places outsource is because other countries may not have as stringent environmental regulations as we have. And
Correct.
So it's dumping literally the stuff that we don't want in our water in somebody else's backyard. And that is obviously a site of tremendous injustice, both ecologically and economically and socially, as we think about those things. So you do a great job. And then, of course, as you said, our participation in those systems, once we know, well, then we can make better and more informed choices, and we can inform others. as well. And that's our responsibility, because once we kind of know how those things work, like you said, palm oil, we can avoid products made with palm
Correct.
oil, because it is so destructive of Borneo and other places. That's great. Thank you for that. Yeah. Other folks, comments, questions, thoughts as we come to the end here? Mary Alice, are you speaking?
I've been giving much thought to how we form our youth in terms of what we've been discussing. And particularly in terms of the youth who are not, and when I say youth, I'm thinking anybody under 35, who is not participating in the Eucharist. We want to have this Eucharistic revival. But if we could only make the connections between what we do with our lives and then what we bring to the Eucharist, and see how we celebrate in the Eucharist who we are as a people who have followed the mission as disciples of Christ. I mean, that's what this is ultimately all about, being disciples in the 21st century. And then seeing that we bring that. And so I was thinking about those wonderful prayers that Paul VI insisted that go into the liturgy, right when the priest places the bread and the wine on the altar, and he says, fruit of the earth and work of human hands, fruit of the vine and work of human hands. If we could only make those connections, what a difference the Eucharist would be for so many more people.
Yes, totally agree. And I think that, we've seen, I just read a study this morning that, religiosity in the United States is declining. No, not new news, but it's continuing. But one of the things that corresponds with that, especially among young people, is that social consciousness is increasing. And so, what if we could link those things together in the way that you're suggesting? I think that is part of the mission of the church. It always has been, it always will be, but it hasn't been central. And I think that a Eucharistic revival sounds great, but I think that a Eucharistic revival that brings people in service of justice and peace and flourishing sounds even better. I don't just want people to receive communion. I want them to be communion. And I think there's a real beauty in that idea of formation that you're talking about, Mary Alice. Thank you.
All right, I think we are up to our end of our time. And it falls to me to give all of our thanks to Paul. I think, excuse me, you brought forth from the scriptures what I would call hidden gems that we could bring into a new context in terms of ecological care. It was a very fine course. I think it could have gone on for a lot longer. I hope we picked up from you a method of reading the scriptures, the way you use the highlighting to bring out ideas that we wouldn't originally connect up with creation, but you gave us a method that we could go forward with, I think. So on so many levels, we're very grateful. So thank you so much, Paul. Thank you, everyone. And with this, we are ending this course.
Yes, thank you all so much.
Thank you, Paul.
Hope to see you again another time. Take care now.
Okay, bye now.